Welcome everyone. Sorry about the technical delay. We're gonna get started 5 minutes later. We're happy to welcome Frauke today to another edition to our Future Names lecture series. Frauke is at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Prior to KTH, she was at SOAS in London. She was at Sussex before then. She has held a variety of positions before that. And she primarily works on low carbon energy transitions, innovations in renewable energy, technology transfer and cooperation, energy policy, climate policy, green economy, and sustainable development. She's published in several peer-reviewed international journals: World Development, Energy Policy, Applied Energy. She's also written a book on low carbon development. And among other projects that she's led as a PI, the more recent one is the Chinese-backed hydropower dams in Asia and Africa. That's from ERSC. And she's an editor of a book that recently came out that's relevant to the ERSC project and the talk today, Chinese hydropower development in Africa. So let's all welcome her today, and then she's going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to do questions at the end. If you have any clarifying questions, we'll keep it pretty informal. So let's all welcome.
Thank you very much, Roshan, for the introduction, and thanks also for having me here. It's very good to be back in the UK. Been here for 10 years and then left, and this is the first time I'm actually coming back. The last time I was in Manchester was about 3 years ago or so, when some of the colleagues here in Manchester were holding a workshop on the rising powers of China, India, Brazil, and their impacts across the globe from an environmental perspective, political, technological, social perspectives. So this was really interesting and very good to be back here. So thanks for the invitation. My colleague Josefina Siciliano unfortunately couldn't come here today, but we've been working on this project together for quite a long time, for 4 years. A lot of the project is still carrying on because we're still involved with writing publications and so on. And there's a lot of other colleagues I should credit as well for the course of this presentation. So I'm going to talk about China's role regarding large hydropower dams in Asia and Africa, and I will be having some points for discussion also about how to achieve more sustainable global dam in the future. So first of all, I will be talking about energy access issues in the global south, and also how the Chinese low-carbon energy investment can contribute to providing energy access and reducing energy poverty around the globe. Then I will be talking about China's global role in hydropower development. And afterwards I will be presenting the findings from a research project called China Goes Global, a comparative study of Chinese hydropower dams in Asia and Africa. And then I will be presenting the findings and the conclusions. So let's first talk about energy access in the global south and Chinese low-carbon energy investments. This photo was taken at the Bui Dam, where you can see the workers, both Chinese and African, who are constructing this dam. And hydropower is considered really important, both in terms of being able to mitigate climate change and being a climate-friendly, low-carbon energy source, but then also for being able to increase a lot of the electric capacity across the globe and to contribute to reducing global energy poverty. So here's a map of global energy poverty today. The orange spots are basically the people without access to electricity, and the green spots are the millions of people without clean cooking facilities. And we still have about 1 billion people today who don't have access to electricity, and about 2.7 billion of people who don't have access to clean cooking facilities. And most of them are based in Southeast Asia, in India, for example, East Asia, and also in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if we break this down for Africa, particularly Nigeria is a country where there's still a lot of people who don't have access to electricity. Hopefully this is going to change in the future. And these are the figures from 2012 in terms of energy and electricity access, and also the projections for 2040. Then you might have heard about the Sustainable Energy for All initiative by the UN, where the aim is that by 2030 everyone across the world will have access to electricity and also to clean cooking fuels. So So if this were to achieve, then hopefully these bars for 2040 wouldn't be there in terms of who doesn't have access to electricity. And we see that some progress is being made, but not as fast as it's being hoped for. So it's questionable whether these targets will be achieved by 2030. Occasionally there's a bit of good news, such as for India, for example. Very recently India has made news announcements that they achieved their village electrification program, that every village in India is supposed to have electricity now. But you can question these figures, because what means electricity access? Does it really mean that everyone has electricity access, or is it just one building, like a school, for example, in the village? And certainly there's still a lot of people out there, also in India, who don't have access to electricity, even as the statistics are, of course, improving and it's looking much better than they used to a few years ago. And dams play a major role here because of the opportunity to provide quite a lot of people with energy access, and also in a climate-friendly way. If we look into the foreign investments in Africa, we can see that China plays a large role. So they're the largest investor in energy investments, but we also see that a lot of other countries are investing in energy infrastructure in Africa. So we have France, for example, there's Italy, Finland, the US, India, Japan, Korea, Brazil, and so on. So a wide range of different kinds of countries that are investing in energy infrastructure in Africa. But the Chinese are leading this field. And what are Chinese firms investing in? About half of the investment in Africa in energy goes to hydropower, according to the statistics by the International Energy Agency. But at the same time, China is also investing in fossil fuels, in coal-fired generation, in natural gas, in oil-fired generation, and also in other renewables like wind, solar, geothermal. So it's really a very wide spectrum of what kind of energy projects are being supported. Many of the countries across Africa have several investments going on by Chinese firms in various types of energy sources. For example, in Kenya, so there's hydro going on, there's geothermal energy, but there's also some fossil fuels going on. And similar what we can also see from Ghana or Zimbabwe, for example. And we can also see that there's quite an equal spread across sub-Saharan Africa in terms of countries that Chinese firms are investing in. And this is not only limited to something that's happening in Africa, but we see this in Southeast Asia as well, that there is an increase in energy investments by Chinese firms, particularly after 2009, 2010. We can see the blue bar is Cambodia, the orange bar is Laos, and the green bar is Myanmar. And we can see that over time, particularly the investments in hydropower in Cambodia and in Laos have increased. And Laos particularly is viewing itself as the battery of Asia. It wants to export its electricity and it wants to make money doing so. And several years ago, the Minister of Public Works was actually quoted as saying, water is our gold. He said, water is our oil. We want to make money with the water and we're going to export it to our neighboring countries, China, but also Thailand. The problem is that many experts in Southeast Asia are assuming now that the balance might soon be tilted, that there is so much capacity that is being built up actually in this area, that at some point China will actually not need to import the electricity because they have so much capacity built up in themselves. And that's going to be quite problematic for Laos because it's building up all the capacity, but it also needs a buyer for it. And then there's this issue of what is the capacity really for? Is it for export, or is it for the urban centers? Is it for the industries, or is it also for rural electrification? Is this really helping people to get access to electricity, and particularly in the rural areas? And this is where a lot of political choices have to be made, obviously. So what we see also in terms of Chinese investments, this is not only happening in Southeast Asia and in Africa, but also in other parts across the world, in OECD countries, for example, there are more Chinese investments in energy infrastructure, but particularly in low carbon energy, like in wind energy, in solar energy, for example. We can see this in the US, a lot of solar, a lot of wind is being built, in Germany as well, a lot of solar. I come from Germany, and in Germany you can see that a lot of people have shifted towards Chinese manufactured solar panels because it's cheaper and they're just as reliable as other ones as well. And we see similar things in Italy, for example, as well. And this is also going along with the huge investments internally, domestically in China, with very huge sums going into investments for renewable energy, for hydropower, for solar, for wind as well. But of course there's a lot of coal-fired generation that is being built at the same time as well. And I think what's happening domestically in China in terms of energy provision is just really being reflected in its overseas investments as well. It's investing in all kinds of energy sources basically. And of course it's better to invest in low carbon energy sources because of climate change and the Paris Agreement, but at the same time there's also the fossil fuel investments happening both domestically and overseas. So let's talk about China's global role in hydropower now. This is a picture from the Bui Dam in Ghana. Quite a lot of studies recently and at the moment are going on about the Bui Dam. So this is one of the flagship productions of Sino-Hydro in Ghana basically. And what is quite interesting is that dams have been around for such a long time and there was so much experience about dam building and particularly the environmental and the social impacts for quite some time. There was the recommendations by the World Commission on Dams, which had a lot of very good recommendations in terms of how to deal with the impacts of dams, how to include social safeguards for the people that are affected and how to improve the environmental impacts and so on. So for a while there was really a decline in the hydropower industry, particularly from OECD financiers such as the World Bank and from OECD dam builders because of these recommendations and because of the critical voices that came from the experiences from the dam industry over many decades. But what happened then afterwards is that with climate change and the sustainable development targets, particularly the energy target and the SE for All initiative, there's a big push towards investing in large hydropower again. And this is to help reduce energy poverty and help meet the Paris Agreement targets. But what we've really seen is that during the time that the OECD dam building declined, the Chinese investors and the Chinese dam builders accessed new markets and became the global leaders because they basically filled a vacuum that happened there. So today, there are about at least 20 large hydropower projects in Africa that are financed and built by Chinese actors. These are the ones that are confirmed, where academics have actually seen that contracts have been signed and that these projects will be built. There are a lot of other ones in the pipeline as well, which might be built at some point or that might not be built, we don't know. And in Asia there are even many more. And it's quite difficult to be sure about the data because a lot of these dams might be planned very carefully, but then unless contracts are signed and unless the actual construction starts, there's a lot of opportunities for them to fall through. For example, this project was also looking at a dam in Nigeria, which never actually happened. So the developers of the dam had gone as far as doing aerial surveys and carrying out community assessments and workshops and involving the people. But actually then it turned out that the dam was really the kind of pet project of the local governor who was not re-elected. And that's when the project was just not taken forward. So just a bit of caution about the data that's there. What we see as well is that China is positioning this as opportunities for start technology transfer and knowledge transfer, and I will be talking a little bit more about that later as well. So what we see today is that the Chinese dam builders are considered global leaders in terms of the technology they use, such as being able to build very large dams. Like when we think about the China Three Gorges Dam, for example, it's a huge dam, 22 gigawatt of capacity. Not every firm and not every country has the capabilities to actually build such a dam and operate and maintain it. So there's huge technological capabilities. Then we also see leadership in terms of the size of the dams that are being built, the investment sums, and also the global coverage. And really, the decline in the financing and the building of dams by OECD players was also more or less around the same time that the Chinese going out policy happened. So this was a policy that was encouraged by the government to create business opportunities abroad for countries, for companies, both private and SMEs, state-owned enterprises, to go outside of China and to invest elsewhere, with the aim of making money, because there's business opportunities out there, there's employment opportunities, and in the end this also means tax returns for the state. So what we see today is that the major dam builders are Sino Hydro, for example, which is part of Power China, also China Three Gorges Corporation, and also some of the major players like some of the major electricity firms. The funding for overseas dams comes from China Exim Bank, but also the China Development Bank, and also Sino-Shore and a few others. So in terms of the drivers of what is driving this forward, it is often being suggested that this is mainly political, but actually in our research we've seen that a lot of this is really also very business oriented, because it's about companies that have the possibility to go into new markets that haven't been explored yet. There's a huge hydropower potential in many of the countries and low and middle income countries, and OECD investors just haven't been investing there very much because of rather unstable investment climates and political climates. But this is not something that seems to be a barrier for many Chinese investors. Then there's also a lot of competition domestically, where a lot of the dams, a lot of the major rivers are already dammed in China, so there isn't that much capacity that can be built. And this is also a business case. Either you also decline in these firms, or you move them along the value chain to maybe be consultants rather than constructors, or you look for new markets elsewhere. And that's a decision that has been taken. And there was also this lack of international competitors. And at the same time, the competition in China is quite intense, and the Chinese dammers are just able to offer lower costs, larger access to finance, and also fewer construction time overruns. Now, in terms of political drivers or political motives, there is this political element, of course, where the countries that have Chinese investments for large dams are quite likely to support the policy directives that China has as well, for example, in terms of the policy on Taiwan. And then there's the geopolitical issues. So for a few dams or other infrastructure deals, there are issues related to trade of some natural resources. For example, for the Bui Dam, there's an agreement on cocoa trading as well. So this happens occasionally, but not very often. And there's this issue, geopolitical issue, about the import of clean electricity, as I mentioned before. Then there are the reputational drivers, so China being seen as the biggest dam builder, so really representing technological superiority and technological skills, and also being able to help other countries that are in similar positions and are still developing, and really to help their neighbors. And not only just in achieving development, but also in achieving green growth. And this is something that's also driving this forward. So a few insights from this project now. So these are some pictures taken throughout the field work. You can see a picture from the Bui Dam announcing that it's just a few tens of kilometers away. Then there's the Kam Chai Dam in Cambodia, and also the Bakun Dam in Malaysia. So we'll be talking about these three dams. The research was funded by the UK Economics and Research Council, the ESSC, and we were looking into 4 different dams: the Bui Dam in Ghana, the Kam Chai Dam in Cambodia, the Bakun Dam in Malaysia, and the Samfara Dam in Nigeria, which then turned out not to be built. And the reason why we looked at a dam that was that early in this process was really because we wanted to capture what was going on before the construction. We wanted to talk to communities. They had very high hopes in terms of what would happen to them, in terms of creating employment and economic growth and having access to infrastructure and services like schools and hospitals, and then the dam actually never came. And on the other side, we had 3 dams that had been built where we could see what happened to these communities. Which is quite a contrast. So I really need to credit my colleagues from SOAS, from the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, Tsinghua University, the University of Ghana, CDRY in Cambodia, NISA in Nigeria, the Open University, and also International Rivers, an NGO with whom we were working as well, which are really very hands-on in terms of the connection they had to policymakers and to the Chinese hydropower industry. So this was a multi-sited comparative case study where we had the same kind of questions that we used in every location, and the fieldwork was in these 4 countries and also in China. So in total we had about 150 interviews in these countries with Chinese firms, with financiers, with policymakers, both on the Chinese side and on the Asian and the African side, at various levels, at the national level, at the local level, and also with OECD and UK firms and business associations, such as the International Hydropower Association, to see their position towards this field of research, and also with donors and experts from academia. We also spoke to community members in all the 4 countries, and we also had 40 focus group discussions with these communities to find out how their life changed, how their life was before the dam and after the dam, what the role was of the national and local government, and also what the role was of the investors and dam builders on the Chinese side. We looked into the environmental impact assessments of these projects to evaluate how good the quality was and what was listed in them, what was maybe omitted. And we also looked into analysis of the CSR, the corporate social responsibility strategies of some of these firms, such as Sino-Hydro. So the conceptual framing that we had was the political ecology of the agent drivers. So the political ecology really putting these human-environment relationships into the center of the research. And a lot of it was really coming down to the control over the access to nature resources, such as land, water, energy, and we were analyzing this. And then the other part of the framework was about the Asian drivers. So China and other emerging economies in Asia and their direct and indirect impacts on other low and middle income countries and their channels of interaction, such as aid, trade, investments. For other projects, we also looked at energy justice issues, because I don't think you can actually talk about dams without having some element of energy justice in there in consideration to the local communities. And we considered dams as large socio-technical systems, where this is not just technological, this is not just engineering or economics, but it's really so much related to social impacts and political impacts as well. So I'm now going to present the findings. This picture was taken in Cambodia, in Kampot, close to where the dam is located. These are some local fishermen going out for fishing, and the boat is quite full. It looks like they're taking their whole family or lots of friends with them as well. We started with the stakeholder mapping, so this is just the stakeholder mapping for Ghana. We did such a mapping for all the countries and also on the Chinese side. It's quite complex. We were looking at the different types of stakeholders, like government, financiers, international NGOs, research institutions, industry, and so on. We were looking into the types of interaction they had as well. Like, is this interaction because of policy directives, for example, or is it funding that is flowing from one side to the other? Is it a form of giving advice? Is it maybe opposition because the local communities are opposing to some of the actions that have been done, and so on. And this was really useful for getting some of our interviews started as well, into mapping out who was important. So now I'm going to present some findings from these 3 dams. So first of all, in Ghana, the Bui Dam, today there's still about 20% of the population that does not have access to electricity. So it's something that has really improved over the years, even in comparison to before, when the Bui Dam hasn't been built yet. The Bui Dam is about 400 megawatt capacity, and it's located on the Black Volta River at the edges of Bui National Park. And this national park issue is actually a theme that runs through all the 3 dams that we were presenting here. because all of them are either built in a national park or in another area that is actually ecologically quite sensitive. It was a project by Hydro, and the contract that was awarded was an EPC contract, an engineering, procurement and construction contract. And this is really quite important what type of contract it is as well, because it's two different kinds of contracts. So there's a BOT contract, a build, operate, transfer contract, and there's the EPC contract. But the EPC contract is basically a turnkey contract. So basically this means the company comes, builds the dam, hands it over to the local authority who's running it. And they are in charge of managing and operating the dam. So this is what happened here with the Booth Power Authority, who's now in charge of operating the dam. And the BOT contract is where the company is in charge over many years and sometimes even decades for operating and maintaining the dam. And I will be talking about that a little bit later. So this was funded by China Exim Bank, about $600 million, and it was part of this wider trade deal, also with the cocoa deal. There was a resettlement of about 1,200 people, so this is something that, but the numbers have really come down in comparison to the Akosombo Dam, for example, which was built in Ghana before, and Ghana has already like 4 or 5 decades of hydropower dam building experience, and a lot of these experiences have really been used for improving what has happened now, so at least it's fewer people that have been resettled. So the affected population were subsistence farmers mainly, and fisher people, and they now live in resettlement areas operated by the Bui Power Authority. So the Chinese element to this dam was really the funding of it, the construction of it, but then the local management of it is really something that is being left to the Ghanaian authorities. And that's the most sticky part, because it deals with compensation for land and houses that are lost, it deals with the impacts on livelihoods, and really providing a life that is worth living for these people. There's also this element of seasonality and climate sensitivity. There's dry season, there's a wet season, and often there are power shortages because there isn't enough water in the reservoir, so it can't run at full capacity. For the Kamtoi Dam in Cambodia, we can see that the energy situation is actually a little bit different. So for a very long time, Cambodia was regarded as one of the countries that have the highest electricity rates in the world. Even today, it's quite similar to the rates in Europe and in the US. And obviously, you can imagine people have a very low income. So for them, high electricity prices is actually something that makes electricity quite unaffordable. Also, there's an underinvestment in the grid, so that a lot of people don't actually have the opportunity to connect to the grid because the grid isn't there. And instead, there are a lot of oil-based generators, quite surprisingly, sometimes even kerosene-based generators, which is basically an aircraft fuel, which people use to have electricity. The rates of electrification have increased after the Kamtoi Dam, so this is really good news, but it's still about half of the population doesn't have access. The Kamtoi Dam is the first dam that was built in Cambodia. It's about 200 megawatt. And this is really important because it's the first time that there is an investor and a dam builder who goes into this new territory. And the Cambodians don't have this decade-long experience of hydropower management and engineering that the Ghanaians, for example, have. So they're quite inexperienced. And that's why the contract with the Sino-Hydro is also different. That's why it's this BOT contract, where it's 44 years of lease, 4 years for the construction, 40 years afterwards that Sino-Hydro is going to operate and manage this dam. Their argumentation is that they need to recoup some of the costs, so by selling the electricity, they can make money, they want to have a protection basically. Also because of seasonality, because some of the output is going to be reduced in the dry season. And some of the policy makers were saying, well, the Kamtoi Dam can actually increase our capacity and provide 60% of the country with electricity. But of course, it's going to be much reduced in the dry season. So again, this is a deal that was between Sino-Hydro and China Exim Bank, so 200 million US dollars for the dam, but it was part of a larger aid package and some trade issues as well. What is interesting here is that there was no resettlement. So that's why often the Kamcha Dam is again regarded as something of a flagship, because it didn't have negative resettlement issues. But actually what was forgotten was also that the people who live downstream are being impacted by the dam. And that's not something that was really taken into much account, because they depend on going back into the forest, where there is no forest now because it's a reservoir. And they were collecting some of the forest products, for example, bamboo products that were then being used to make baskets to be sold on the market. And this is something that they can't do now anymore. So there's definitely livelihoods impacts that weren't completely taken into account. Then we also had this issue of extreme flooding events. Some people are own mango plantations, and they were actually saying this dam is quite useful. It's going to reduce the flooding. It's going to be better control. It's not going to destroy our mango trees with the next flooding. But actually this has also become more unpredictable. So a few years back there were torrential rainfalls, and the floodgates just had to be opened to release the pressure from the dam. And then Sino-Hydro said it alerted the local municipality, local government. And the local government said it alerted the people, but somehow they didn't have enough time to actually leave the area, so a lot of the houses were flooded. And this is again where you have a big flooding event, even though this is supposed to be for flood control. And it's not entirely sure about the governance of this as well, because with Sino-Hydro being there and operating this dam, a lot of the responsibility rests with them rather than with the local communities. And it's this kind of shifted, unclear responsibilities of who is supposed to manage the impacts of the dam now, and where the government isn't entirely sure about the responsibility and the chance of communication that Sino-Hydro has, and vice versa. So the last dam in Borneo in Malaysia is in Sarawak, so East Malaysia. And this is a very interesting place because this dam is basically a white elephant. It's an area which has about 100% electrification rates. There is no significant shortage of electricity. And the whole argument for having this dam there was always quite futuristic. So the idea was that more electricity is needed in Peninsular Malaysia. So from Borneo to Peninsular Malaysia, you could lay undersea cables for like 1,000 kilometers or so, and then provide electricity in Peninsular Malaysia. Obviously, this is quite futuristic. In Germany, where I come from, there's already problems with connecting some of the offshore wind farms with undersea cables. This is a large part of the project, which takes quite a long time. So how is Malaysia going to manage this over hundreds of kilometers? And the other motivation was that this could be an industrial hub. You could have aluminium smelters there, for example. You would have access to the electricity, you would have access to the water. And there were companies like Alcan, who's in the aluminium industry, who were considering this. But once they found out more about the environmental and the social impacts, they actually dropped the deal. So you have this dam there, which is supplying electricity, but it's 2,400 megawatt capacity, so far too big for the position of where it actually is. It's actually the biggest dam in Southeast Asia, and it's the first in a series of large dams that are supposed to be built as part of SCORE, the Sarawak Renewable Energy Corridor, where most of the renewable energy is supposed to be hydro. Afterwards, the Morum Dam was built quite close to this, so another big dam, and actually some of the mistakes that were made at Bakun have been rectified at Morum. So there really was a lesson for how not to do things and how to improve things next time. But then, again, the Morum Dam just raises the same issues. Why do you build such large dams in an area where you don't need that electric capacity? So again, this was Sino-Hydro, but they were involved with a Malaysian consortium, such as Sindarbi, a large Malaysian company that was involved as well. So their part was actually even less than in the Bui Dam, because they were part of being the constructors. And this was an EPC dam as well, so engineering, procurement, construction. So they're building the dam and they're handing it over to the local authorities. This is being managed by Sarawak Hydro, so a local fund now. The key sticky point about this project was a resettlement of about 10,000 ethnic minorities, the Kayan, the Kenyan, the Iban, the Banan, the Laharaman, and the Ukit. And some of these people were semi-nomadic before. They lived in the rainforest. So their lives really changed because they've been taken from living in longhouses right by the river to living in more modern houses in resettlement areas, not having access to the river, not having access to the forest as such anymore. So it's really been a change of lifestyle. So when we were comparing these three different dams, we were asking the local communities and also the policymakers, what are the main issues that come out with these projects? What is the most important? And we see quite a lot of differences. So for the Kamcha Dam, one of the largest issues is really about the access to local resources, like land, forest, because they can't access the forest anymore, it's flooded, there's a reservoir. There's the issue of having access to food, which partly comes from the forest, and to water, and also energy access. Because very ironically, the people who live there, many of them still don't have access to electricity. So you have this huge dam, which is generating electricity. It's transporting the electricity to the urban centers, mainly to Phnom Penh, the capital. But at the same time, you have the local people who are affected by it on a daily basis, and they don't have access to electricity. So this is really quite ironic. And a lot of it could have been rectified really in the project design, where it could have been said, we are going to pay for electricity access for these local people. Because the sticky point is often the connection fee to the grid, because they have to pay about $100 of connection fee to the grid, but they don't have these financial means. And then there's others who are wealthier, so they have electricity access, but not everyone in these affected communities. And for the Bui Dam, the main issues were the livelihood changes, so how livelihoods changed, how people who used to be fishermen, fishing on the river, couldn't do this anymore. There's still water somewhere, but it's just having different flow rates, it's more, it's a reservoir. And there's also the issue about agriculture, like the fertility of soils, where you can't grow the same crops that we've been growing before. Then for the Bakun Dam, we see a lot that it was about compensation and consultation and resettlement, because obviously life just changed for a lot of the people, and particularly the older people were quite concerned because their traditional lifestyles of being had just changed, from being semi-nomadic, living in the rainforest, to being in these resettlement areas and suddenly not being able to have the same lifestyle and livelihoods anymore. And also there was this element that people were compensated for the old houses they had, but they thought it was too low, which is something that's come through for the Bui Dam as well. And where the government then asked people, well, they gave them the compensation, but they also said, here are new houses, they're better than what you had before. There's proper toilets in them, for example. And you're nearer to schools and you're nearer to healthcare. So basically, we're going to make you pay for the new houses, even though it was forced resettlement. So that's something that really didn't go down well with the people. And probably a decade later or so, the Prime Minister then came to change this decision and went to Sarawak and actually amended this, and now people don't have to pay for these houses anymore. So that's something very positive that has come out of this after many years. So let's go into some of the details for this dam as well. So with the Kamcha Dam, you have this BOT contract. So it's raising all these issues about governance. Who is responsible for compensation, where people have lost land, for example, or where the lifestyles and their livelihoods are impacted. And also who deals with complaints. The locals have had complaints, they've had demonstrations, they've been signing petitions, and so on. They've been delivering it to the local government. They've been delivering it to the national government in Phnom Penh. And the national government in Phnom Penh has then been delivering these messages to Sino Hydro, who are based next to the local government, next to where the people live. So it's a very complicated way of communication, and it's not easy for these people to contact the company, and they rather go through the local government. But at the same time, the local government isn't entirely sure how to deal with the company as well. So there's a budget in there for afforestation measures, as a mitigation measures for the forests that were lost, but the local government officials are actually complaining that they can't access that money, and that it's not entirely clear how to approach this because Sino Hydro is in charge of it. So this is the danger with the BOT contracts. All these issues that would be straightforward if you had one agency are becoming more complicated because you have several agencies who are in charge. Then there was the issue about environmental impact assessment. So Cambodia has an environmental impact assessment law in place, which is actually quite appropriate and up to standards. But at the same time, for the Kamchai Dam, this was neglected. The own local laws were neglected. And this is just because Cambodia is in such a situation where there are so few investments from other investors happening, particularly in the energy sector. So this dam was negotiated at the very highest level, at the level of the Prime Minister, because it was so important for them to be able to get this dam, to be able to get electricity access and generation capacity for Phnom Penh and other areas. So they violated their own environmental impact assessment laws. And the EIA was really just like a tag on. So it was basically delivered 7 months after the dam was in operation. And usually it should be done before any project is being built, because it's supposed to assess whether the project should be built or not, or if it should be slightly amended, or if it should be built in different locations. There's also this issue like with the Gui National Park about being built in a national park, at the edges of a national park. So you have this whole issue about ecological impacts, biodiversity, and so on. And what is also the issue is the issue of knowledge transfer. So we'll be coming back to that in a few minutes, talking more about technology transfer. Because with the BOT contract, with the Sino Hydro being in charge of the dam for so long, you have limited knowledge of how to manage and operate the dam, because it's mostly resting with Chinese engineers rather than Cambodian engineers. So this is something that needs to change in the next few decades when the dam will be transferred to Cambodian authorities. Then for the Bui Power Dam, the Bui Dam, a positive element is that everyone has access to electricity, so this is something that has been brought to the resettlement areas. The environmental impact assessment was done by a British firm, and this was also done up to recent standards, but you have this issue of being built in a national park. If you look into the recommendations of the World Bank or the IFC or the International Hydropower Association Sustainability Protocol, then you can see that it's not such a good idea to build a dam in a national park. So this really raises questions. Well, aren't there no other locations where a dam can be built? Because you have to think about the hydrology, the geology. Does this make sense? But generally, the international guidelines are the protected areas such as national dams should be avoided, such as national parks should be avoided for a large dam building. There were also some opposition and some complaints from the resettled communities to the Bui Power Authority, so that's a main authority that is in charge. For example, in relation to land scarcity and the fertility of the land, with regards to lack of employment, alternatives, and so on. And actually, both for these 3 dams, for a short-term perspective, a lot of employment was created for the construction on the dam by African and Asian citizens. And for the Bui Power Authority, this is being managed by the Ghanaians, so again, employment opportunities. Whereas for Cambodia, you see that it's mainly the Chinese engineers who are in charge. And in the Bui resettlement areas, you see a lot of issues that are coming up with the urbanization of the area as well, increases of crime, increases of prostitution, increasing of illegal mining and logging and so on, which just wasn't there before. So for the Bakun Dam, the issues have been mentioned. The other issue is also about the environmental impact assessment. So that's something that could have been better, where mitigation measures weren't really sufficiently addressed. And there were a lot of issues about corruption around the dam as well. And this also happened in stages. So you have a resettlement first, which was about 10 years before the dam was actually built. And this was partly because there was a lack of an investment and a lack of a dam builder, whereas these plans were in place for quite a long time. And then there was the deforestation of tropical hardwood, where a lot of money was made by selling the tropical hardwood. It also gave a lot of opportunities for accessing this rainforest, because it's a very pristine rainforest in Borneo, and you have orangutans there, the Sumatran rhinoceros and so on. And with these opening these access roads into the rainforest, it just brought a lot of other companies as well. Logging companies, palm oil companies. A lot of palm oil plantations are being planted now in this area. And the problem with the indigenous people was really that they don't have the formal land titles. So it's customary lands that they have been using for hundreds of years. But this is not something that is enshrined in the Constitution. So basically they couldn't prove that this was their land. And they lost the farmland, the forests, the fishing grounds. But some of them are quite entrepreneurial. There are several ones who have started a homestay for tourists, which has been marketed as ecotourists. There are others who are working on the oil palm plantations. A lot of people of the younger generation who now get scholarships to go to Kuala Lumpur, for example, for getting a degree at the universities, and who then come back and say they particularly want to be engineers. But there was also a lot of conflicts, and there's a lot of difference between the different ethnic groups as well. And those that were said to be nomadic, and those that had more traditional lifestyles, they're really the ones that are the worst off, because they have really had problems to adapt to these new lifestyles. And going from a non-monetarized lifestyle where you get everything you need from the forest and the river, to suddenly being able to pay for the food you need, for example. And when we visited the Penang longhouses, we could really see that there was more poverty in these communities than in the other ones. Where the children didn't go to school during the day, and they couldn't because these communities couldn't pay for the transport, the bus to take the children to the school, whereas the other communities had their children in school. On the positive side, a lot of positive things have happened in terms of bringing more progress to these areas, clinics and schools at Frauke, for example. But some people are resisting. So they are, for example, occupying the land of the oil palm companies who are planting oil palm plantations around the resettlement area. And their logic is that basically, we've been here first, this is our land. Now you come, you take it, you plant your plantations here. We are going to take your land and we are going to plant our palm oil here and make some money on your land, basically. So I'm briefly going to talk about technology transfer and knowledge transfer, because it's such an important element as well when you talk about transfer of energy technology from one place to the other. And also with a narrative of China helping other countries in the global south, basically. So conceptually, I'm dividing this into 3 flows, really. So you have the hardware, basically. So that's the capital goods, engineering services, product designs, managerial services. So everything that has to do with the technology itself and the construction in it. And then you have the know-how. So this is basically the skills and the knowledge for operating and maintaining these technologies. Such as if you have a solar panel or a wind turbine or a hydropower dam, how do you actually operate this? How do you repair it if it's broken? What do you do? This is the know-how. And then the most complicated is really the know why. So this is the possibility for increasing the innovative capabilities. So actually having the experience for being able to generate technical change. So for example, to say, we have this hydropower dam, maybe just a small one, maybe just a small hydropower plant in our country. We can learn and train our technicians and our engineers how to do hydropower engineering, how maybe to tweak some of this technology and use it and set up their own firms, or maybe even a joint venture with some other investor. So the first flows, the hardware and then the know-how is really contributing to the creation of new production capacity. So building some kind of technology or infrastructure. And the last flow, the know-why, is really about the accumulation of innovation capabilities. So being able to innovate. And this is really the most difficult part to achieve. And this raises the question, how can a country such as Ghana or Cambodia really go from just being able to manage these dams to having their own companies, hydropower expert companies. And if you have a country such as Ghana where there's already 4 or 5 decades of experience, that's something that's more likely. If you have a country such as Cambodia, which has no experience, it's quite unlikely. So what we see in terms of technology transfer, knowledge transfer, the hardware was definitely transferred. All the 3 dams are there. So this has happened. This is where China has been very instrumental in terms of first being able to have the investments, and secondly being able to actually build these dams. In terms of the know-why, we see the EPC contracts for the Bui Dam and the Bakun Dam. There's definitely some knowledge that has been transferred to the Ghanaians and the Malaysians of how to operate and maintain the dam and how to repair it. And this could have been having like staff training sessions, for example, or joint engineering workshops, or them visiting Sino-Hydro and so on. But with Cambodia and the Kamcho Dam, because it's a BOT contract, this hasn't really happened. And it's very much a case where you could say, maybe this is happening in like 30, 40 years, because there's a delayed transfer of this knowledge. But at the same time, we're not entirely sure about it. And then there's also the know why. So this is about the innovation capabilities. So are these countries, are these firms that operate these dams now able to at some point replicate this and maybe have joint ventures with some other dam builders, maybe at a very small level, at a small scale hydropower level, or not. And this is something where definitely this hasn't happened for the Kamcho Dam. Whether this happened for the Bui Dam or the Bakun Dam, I am not sure, we will see. But this is really the most difficult part to achieve, where you can say in the future we don't only want like OECD dam builders or Indian, Chinese, Brazilians, but maybe even Ghanaian dam builders as well. So it's something to see for the future. Then some brief considerations on how the Chinese are different in the dam building industry. And first of all, you need to disaggregate these different responsibilities as well. So you can't just say, like, this is what the Chinese are doing, this is what the Italians are doing, this is what the Canadians are doing. But it's really about the different responsibilities they have. So is this an EPC contract? Are they basically the contractors to build this dam? Is this a BOT contract? Are they also supposed to manage the impacts, deal with local communities? Are they the operator? Are they maybe just a consultant doing the EIA? And so on. And for BOT projects, it's just more responsibility and more collaboration that needs to happen between the local authorities and the dam builders. We also see that a lot of this comes down to the negotiation standards. So what kind of contract has been negotiated with the host country? And what are the standards? Is this the host country standards, which in some low and middle income countries might be lower than in China, whereas the standards for dam building in China are relatively high? Or even higher, is it the international hydropower association's standards, like the Sustainability Assessment Protocol, or the new guidelines that come out in December 2018, or is it the World Bank, the IFC standards? And then the standards are just going to be higher, and that's going to have an impact on the dam builders, never minding who they are. But really, what we see, what is different with Chinese dam builder thing is, for example, the different landing conditions. So not having this conditionality attached, where the World Bank might say that we're lending to you, but maybe think about liberalizing this market, or think about what's happening with democracy here, whereas the Chinese are non-conditional basically. They don't really care what's happening in this country or not. Even though, of course, this has been changing as well in countries such as in Myanmar, for example. The Chinese investors have also been much more careful than they were like 10 years ago. And then you have this issue of state-backed finance. There's just a lot more financial power that is behind these firms, particularly behind SOEs like Sino Hydropower China, that other companies do not have. We also see that the Chinese firms operate in countries where the rule of law and environmental law enforcement is weaker than in other countries. And this is something where a lot of OECD firms didn't wish to operate, because the investment climate is also riskier. And that's why some of the Chinese firms have been able to go into these markets. And what we've seen, at least like a decade ago or so, is that the standards on environmental and community relations were lower. And this is something that is improving. You can really see a learning curve, and you can see how Chinese dam builders are really becoming more conscious because the world is watching. There's a lot of attention to them, and this is really improving over time. And at the workshops we were holding, we had Sino Hydro there who was saying that they are very keen to learn from such initiatives and to learn about the IHA's sustainability assessment protocol, for example, but at the same time we don't see that they've adopted it yet. So there's a certain level of awareness, but we aren't there yet that this has been implemented. And I think at the other time it also depends on only looking at what the Chinese dam builders are doing, or maybe Indians, but you also have OECD dam builders such as Salini Impregno in Ethiopia, which has been building the Jiba 3 dam, where there's a lot of issues about local communities, about compensation, about human rights, and so on. So you really have to, rather than putting everyone into the same category, really look at what the case is. What is really the track record of this company, and also how has it been performing in this project compared to another one, and what was actually their role? How far were they really involved? So, in conclusion, what we see is that China has become a rising power in global energy investments in the global south, increasingly also investing in the global north. And we see that many of these drivers for these investments are really related more to businesses or business opportunities rather than politics. And of course politics also plays a role, but it's not the driving force. We see that there are a lot of energy projects by Chinese companies in Asia and in Africa, but they're really across the entire electricity mix. Hydropower plays a dominating role here, but there's also lots of other investments and other energy sources going on. We can also see that large hydropower can really help to reduce energy poverty in Africa and Asia, but this really has to go along with investments in the grid as well, because you can't just have these large infrastructure projects there and then not connecting people to the local grid. There really need to be strategies of how to increase electrification and particularly rural development as well. And this is really the downside with hydropower, that often the gains are at the national level or for the urban center, but rarely at the rural areas. And the rural areas are those that are impacted, these are the local communities. And this is where the benefit sharing of hydropower just needs to be thought through more. So the local people who are affected need to see some more benefit over the national level. And then of course, hydropower is being considered as a low-carbon energy source. You can analyze how much CO2 is in the concrete that's being made for building the dam, or how much methane emissions you have from stagnant water in the reservoir, but overall it's still much more positive than if you were building a coal-fired plant, for example. And this is actually a choice, because in Cambodia, for example, there was so much controversy about the dams that were built, so that the government actually recently rather invested in a coal power plant. This is of course very negative for the climate, but for them there's less opposition there. And that's what we also have to keep in mind. Like, what are the alternatives? Is it a dam or is it a coal-fired station? Then we see that the environmental and the social implications of the hydropower developments in Africa and in Asia are really exacerbated by what's already there, like social injustices that exist, they're being exacerbated, and also poor implementation of the mitigation strategies, or maybe not having any mitigation strategies in place at all. So how can we change this? One improvement could be made by more clearly outlining the responsibilities between the dam builders, the investors, and also the host governments. And I don't think it just comes down to the dam builders, it really comes down to having some responsibility by the investors as well. What kind of project are they actually investing in? And it comes down to the responsibility of the host government to make sure that legislation is put in place, such as for environmental impact assessment, for example, and that this is being monitored and safeguarded as well. And the global hydropower industry would be much more sustainable if all the players were adhering to international or national regulations and standards, such as the World Bank recommendation and also the Sustainability Assessment Protocol by the IHA. So improving siting, for example, not having dams being built in national parks, thinking better about the impacts of people even downstream, thinking about compensation and resettlement and how the impacts on the locals could be minimized. And a lot of these regulations and standards, they are already there. They've been coming up the last few years, like for example, last December with the new suggestions by the IHA. So this is something where the hydropower industry has really become more sustainable and where we see progress. It's just that every dam builder is not implementing this. If they were all going to implement this, this industry would be more sustainable. But at the same time, we also need to think about whether alternative energy options might be more appropriate. And you need to consider whether a certain dam is really the ideal investment in a particular location at a particular time, or whether it wouldn't be better to either do better siting, have it somewhere else, or maybe invest in several smaller hydropower plants, or to invest into other energy options such as renewables, like wind and solar, for example. But of course, this also raises the issue. Like if I'm a policymaker and I can invest in 500 megawatts of capacity at once with one dam, or I invest in 500 wind turbines, maybe spread over 10 wind farms. That's of course something that is to consider, and where a lot of countries who are more authoritarian, more centralized, prefer also a more centralized energy option. And finally, if you would like to read a little bit more about this, Josbina and I and the whole project team have been writing this book on Chinese hydropower developments in Africa and Asia, challenges and opportunities for sustainable global dam building. So you can Google this, or otherwise it's available on the Routledge website and many bookstores as well.